Several years ago, I had the chance to coach a youth football team. And the season did not go as I had planned. To be honest, we only won 3 games. I think we went 3-8. And so as soon as the season ended, I said to myself, I got to figure out what separates the good coaches from the great coaches. What separates good leaders from the great leaders? What separates good musicians from the great musicians? And so for like the last 10 years or so, that's kind of been a little bit of a hobby of mine, is studying the greats in any field. I'm a little bit of a sucker that when I'm on Instagram or Facebook and I see one of those reels and any great person, coach, celebrity, author, whoever it is, when I see them talking, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to listen to that reel because I usually learn something. I just love studying the greats. And there's one thing I've discovered, one common theme, at least one common theme rather, that all the greats have. It's focus. They're relentless. You see, the great ones know how to keep the main thing the main thing. I came across a musician this week, a great musician, a story about her. And she was once asked, what made you great? What did you do to become this great, well-known musician? In fact, her response was interesting. Her response was planned neglect. You see, for years, she started her day like we all do. She would wake up, eat her breakfast, do her chores, make her bed, do all the same stuff that you and I do, and she began to realize that that was hindering her from being the best musician she could be. And so she made a big change. When she woke up, the very first thing that she did was play her instrument. She intentionally neglected everything else in her life, from her meals to her breakfast to making up her bed to maybe even taking a shower, until she had gotten that practice time in. This musician, this great musician, knew how to keep the main thing the main thing. She knew her mission. She knew her purpose. And she stayed focused on that mission. And maybe it's just my super competitive side coming out. That side that hates losing 8 games in a youth football league. But I think there's something admirable about that. Something we can learn from them. Something we can apply even in our own spiritual lives. To focus on what really matters. And I don't know about you, but that can be difficult at times. It can be difficult for you and I to keep our focus on what really matters, to keep the main thing. And yes, that happens in our life spiritually and physically. I mean, think about it this way. If you had somebody come up to you today and ask, what's the main thing in your life? What's your mission? What's your purpose? What are you trying to accomplish in your life? How are you answering it? For some of us who are parents, we're trying to be the best parent, the best husband, the best father, the best mother, the best wife we can possibly be. And so our answer is going to reflect that. For some of us who are very career-driven, very focused, we're going to answer maybe perhaps on being the best career, being the best professional that we can be. Maybe some of us would even answer, well, I'm just trying to glorify God and tell as many people as possible about Jesus. And that's a really good answer. You see, even if we're disciples of Christ, we know our mission, we know our purpose, we know we're supposed to glorify God, we know we're supposed to tell others about Jesus, but sometimes between knowing and doing, there's this tremendous gap. Like, we know we're supposed to glorify God. We know we're supposed to tell others about Jesus. But we don't always live that way. So if you and I want to accomplish the mission that God has given us to do, if we want to be those purposeful Christians, then we need to learn how to keep the main thing the main thing. But in a world filled with distractions, In a world where right now, if you have your cell phone on and it's not in airplane mode, you are getting alerts right this minute. How can we stay focused? Well, here's the good news. We do not have to figure it out. Paul gives us the playbook there in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Now, we've been working our way through 1 Corinthians here at Issaquah. And one of the things we're seeing here in 1 Corinthians is that Corinth was a church in crisis. They had a lot of serious issues there in that church. There in 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, Paul writes to them and tells them, hey guys, you're divided, and it shouldn't be that way. That God's people shouldn't be divided. You need to be united. Look to the gospel. Christ died for all of you. You were all baptized into Christ. Remember that. Be united. Be one in Christ Jesus. And there in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and 6, Paul writes to them and says, guys, there's some sin in your church. Some really bad sin. Some really heinous sin. Some sins that aren't even present among your pagan neighbors. And it shouldn't be this way. And once again, he points them to the gospel. And he reminds them that the gospel is supposed to change them. But there in 1 Corinthians 7, the book takes a turn. Paul writes and says, now concerning about the matters that you wrote to me about. And then starting in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul begins to address some of their questions. First about marriage. And then in 1 Corinthians 8, about food sacrificed to idols. And to you and I today, food sacrificed to idols doesn't seem like that big a deal. But in the ancient world, for the early Christians, it was a big deal. And Paul uses that question as a springboard to talk about those gray areas. There's matters of opinion, those matters of judgment. So much so that at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul says this, and as he's trying to summarize and really kind of drive his point home there in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 13, he says these words. If food causes my brother or sister to fall, I will never again eat meat. That hamburger, that juicy steak, that fried chicken sandwich, I'm not eating again, so I won't cause my brother or sister to fall. Paul says, my brother, my sister in Christ who is hurt by me eating that steak, I'm not going to eat meat because of it. You see, when we see there in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul had a laser-like focus on what really matters. And there in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he says, oh guys, by the way, remember when I was there in Corinth? Where was my focus? Remember my example. How did I live when I was among you? It was the gospel, Paul says, not my rights. That yes, I had the right to eat that steak. I had the right to eat that chicken sandwich. I had the right to eat that hamburger, but I didn't. I refrained from exercising my rights, so I didn't hurt anyone. And then there, starting at the very end of the chapter, Paul really outlines two attitudes that you and I need to have in our own life if we are going to run to win. And so let's go ahead and read 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23 to kick off our study together today. Paul writes there in verse 19, although I am free from all and not anyone's slave, I have made myself a slave to everyone in order to win more people. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law, like one under the law, though myself am not under the law, to win those under the law. To those without the law, like one without the law. Though I am not without God's law, but under the law of Christ, to win those without the law. To the weak, I became weak in order to win the weak. I have, he says, become all things to all people, so that I might by every possible means save some. Think about who is saying these words, who is writing these words for a second. It's Paul. It's Paul, the very Paul who in his old life, before he became a Christian, traveled all over the world putting Christians in jail. Now Paul says, I travel all over the world doing whatever I can do to tell others about Christ. But think about what Paul is saying for a second. This is Paul, a Jew, a devout Jew, a Jew who had studied under Gamaliel, and in English terms, in American terms today, that would kind of like be going to Harvard to get a PhD in Old Testament. Like, this guy had everything going for him. And if you're a Jew like Paul in the first century, a devout Jew who studied under Gamaliel, you looked at the Gentiles and you thought they were dogs. They were unclean. And when I say dogs, not the cuddly ones you keep in your house, by the way. Like the stinky, mangy, the ones that you see running around your neighborhood and you're like, I need to stay away from those. Kids, don't play with those dogs. Don't pet those dogs. That's how Paul viewed the Gentiles. Unclean, filthy. He didn't touch them. He didn't go near them. He didn't even talk to them. But the gospel changed things for Paul. He stopped seeing Gentiles as dogs and started seeing them as people loved by God. So much so that he spent the rest of his life telling anyone and everyone he could, including Gentiles, about Jesus. He was focused on his mission. I mean, just look a couple of verses earlier there in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 on how he describes his laser-like focus there in verse 12 as he's kind of outlining it and talking about his work there in Corinth. Toward the end of the verse, he goes, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. Instead, we endure everything so that we will not hinder the gospel of Christ. A few verses down there in verse 16. For if I preach the gospel, I have no reason to boast, because I am compelled to preach, and woe to me, judgment on me if I don't preach the gospel. Another couple verses down in verse 18. What's my reward? Paul says, to preach the gospel and offer it free of charge and not make use of my full rights in the gospel. Paul knew that the gospel was his mission. Paul knew that the gospel was his purpose. Paul understood that the gospel was more important than his personal rights. That the gospel, he says, is more important than his opinion. The gospel was the most important thing in his life. So much so that there in verse 19 he says, although I am free from all and not anyone's slave, I have made myself a slave to everyone. Here's a free man in the first century who is saying, I am humbling my person from the status of a free person, from the status of a Roman citizen, and I am humbling myself and acting and living as a slave in order to win more people. Folks, 2,000 years ago, you did not make yourself a slave. Today, you don't make yourself a slave. But Paul says, I'm willing to do it if it helps me preach the gospel. I think there's a lesson we can learn from Paul there in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. That if we want to talk to people about Jesus, that you and I must be flexible. That's the first attitude, that first trait that we see in guys like Paul, the guys that excel at sharing their faith. And so right off the bat here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul is turning their world upside down. Because he's trying to show the Corinthians, in us, perhaps, that they needed an attitude adjustment. That following Christ isn't about getting my way. Following Christ is about sacrificing my rights for the gospel. That's how Paul lived when he was among them in Corinth. You see, Paul realized that the gospel wasn't just for people who looked like him, wasn't just for people who talked like him, wasn't just for people who dressed like him. Jesus didn't die just for the Jews. Jesus, the gospel, is available to everyone. So Paul does there in the text anything he could to reach everyone. Look what he says one more time in verse 20. He says, "To the Jews I became a Jew." He dressed like a Jew. He talked like a Jew. He ate with the Jews. He did Jewish things. And there in verse 21, to win those without the law, I think that is Gentiles. He says, when I'm around the Gentiles, I eat like a Gentile. I'll talk to the Gentiles. I'll do their things. To the weak, he became the weak in order to win the weak. He became all things to all people so that he could save as many people as possible. Paul took time to find out where they were and met them where they were. We see that in Paul's preaching there in the book of Acts. When we look at Acts, there, when he's talking to the Jews there in the synagogues, he opens up his Hebrew Bible, his Old Testament, and starts from the prophecies in the Old Testament and starts to talk about Jesus from those prophecies. But when Paul stands there in Mars Hill before the philosophers of Athens, he doesn't start with the Old Testament. He starts with a Greek poet. He looks at creation, and from a Greek poet, he preaches Christ. Paul's message never changed, but his methods did. What Paul is teaching us by his example is that some flexibility is required to reach the lost. You know, that's easy for us to talk about. It's easy for us to think about. But it's a whole lot harder to do. Because it means we have to lay aside our preferences. We may have to sacrifice our rights, our opinions, and put the gospel first. But isn't the gospel worth it? Paul thought so. And that's why he was willing to lay down his own life, his own rights, for one reason there in verse 23. To win souls. Paul didn't want any cultural barriers to stand in the way. Paul didn't want any socioeconomic barriers to stand in the way. Paul put the gospel first. He kept the main thing the main thing. And so far in my time here in Washington, here in Issaquah, I just love that about this congregation. Your desire to keep the gospel first, your desire to be flexible and do whatever we can to reach the lost. When I'm meeting with the elders, like the first thing we talk about is how can we reach people? How can we reach people and bring people to Jesus? I love that. Let's keep it up. Because it's so easy for us to lose focus. So easy for us to realize that sometimes the biggest barrier between someone and Jesus is me. Sometimes we want people to come to Jesus on our terms. We're not willing to lay aside our traditions or our preferences. But folks, this is not a new struggle. They dealt with it 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, the gospel was spreading like wildfire. Jews and Gentiles were coming to Christ. They're obeying the gospel, and they're starting to follow Christ, so much so that there's this question, what do we do about the Gentiles? Do we make Gentiles become Jews? And so some of the church leaders gather in Jerusalem, and they look at what God is doing among the Gentiles. They look at the Scriptures. And they draw this conclusion there in Acts chapter 15 that we don't need to make the Gentiles Jews. In fact, there in Acts chapter 15 and verse 19, James stands up and says these words. And therefore, In my judgment, he says, we should not cause difficulties for those among the Gentiles who turn to God. We don't need to make it harder than it has to be. The gospel's not about making Gentiles into Jews. The gospel's about making us one in Christ Jesus. The gospel's about making us like Christ. You see, Paul and James realized that the good news of the gospel is about unity. It's about God's power to save everyone. And that's why Paul says there in the text that I've become all things to all people so I can save anyone. He did what he could to keep the main thing the main thing. He gave up his time, his money, his resources, his career to do what he could to bring people to Christ. If we look at and zoom out and look at the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, what Paul is trying to teach the Corinthians there in the text. One of the things he's trying to teach them, and I think us as well, is that the gospel is more important than our comfort. Paul knew that, Paul lived that, and that's why he was so effective in the mission field. That he kept that main thing the main thing. So what does it take for us to be like Paul? It takes some flexibility, but also takes some discipline. It takes discipline for us to keep the main thing the main thing. Just look at what he says there in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 24. This was our scripture reading a few moments ago. We'll read it once again, where Paul says there in the text, "Don't you know that the runners in a stadium all race, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way to win the prize. Now everyone who competes exercises self-control in everything. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. So I do not run as like one who runs aimlessly or box like one beating the air." I mean, just imagine that image that he's putting before us there in verse 26. Instead, Paul says, "I discipline my body and bring it under strict control, so that after preaching to others, I myself will not be disqualified." Have you ever thought of your walk with Christ as a race? As your spiritual journey as a competition? For a lot of us, that may make us a little bit uncomfortable to see our walk with Christ as a race. But Paul wasn't uncomfortable about that. Paul realized that sports can help us understand, help us learn important spiritual principles. And I think that's one reason Paul uses so many sports metaphors in his writings. They're all over the place in Paul's writings. That's why he uses a couple there in the text we just read. He realized that sports could teach the Corinthians some very important lessons. And they would have been very familiar with these sports metaphors. Corinth was home to the Isthmian Games. They were kind of like the ancient Olympics, but they were held there in Corinth once every 2 years. And so they were familiar with the images that Paul was using. They had seen the runners run. They had seen the boxers box. They understood that athletes would train for years for a chance to compete in the games. Just think about the athletes we just watched a month or two ago in the Olympics. Some of those athletes trained for years, for one shot, for one chance, to show the world that they deserved a medal. They woke up early, they stayed up late, they watched what they ate, they disciplined their bodies, and they did anything and everything they could to win that medal. And Paul looks at those athletes in his day. We can look at the athletes in our day and go, don't you realize that the runner at the Olympics, the runner at the Isthmian Games, trains for a month to receive the prize? And only one then got the prize. There was no bronze, silver, and gold medal back then. There was one guy who got the prize. And Paul looks at the Corinthians and says, run in such a way to win. It's not like the 5Ks we got today, where everybody gets a medal or everybody gets a trophy or everybody gets a t-shirt. Only one person got the prize. And so the Corinthians, the athletes, had to compete in such a way, train in such a way, where they were the one person who got the prize. The image that Paul describes there in the text kind of reminds me of Hebrews chapter 12. That great image that the Hebrew writer gives to us in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Where he's been looking there in Hebrews chapter 11 at those great heroes of faith. Guys like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses. He's been looking at their faith and how they disciplined their bodies. Leaving behind family, leaving behind friends, and in Moses' case, leaving behind life in the royal household to be a part of the people of God. And there in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2, 1 to 2, he says this, "Therefore, since we have such a great cloud, or such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us," because Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Noah are watching us, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Paul says, discipline your body. The Hebrew writer says, discipline your body. You know, I've noticed something about marathon runners and 5K runners in the very few times I've attempted to run a 5K. They don't run in ski jackets. They don't run in parkas. And why do you think that is? Generally speaking, parkas and ski jackets hinder you from running the race effectively. They slow you down, and so even in a cold weather race, runners usually don't run in parkas. They get rid of anything and everything that will slow them down, that will keep them from winning the race. That's the attitude you and I need to have. That's the discipline you and I need to have as we seek to run our race. And yet we know that there are things in your life, there are things in my life that slow us down, that keep us from winning. They keep us from accomplishing our mission. And what Paul is telling us there in the text is get rid of it. Focus on the prize. Keep the main thing the main thing. He's telling us that victory is impossible without sacrifice. And again, once again, let's direct our attention to the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. That Paul is describing the great lengths he went to reach the lost, how he made all these sacrifices, traveled all over the ancient world, how he's constantly disciplining himself and his body to make sure he stays on the right track. And folks, I think we can learn from Paul's example. That winning souls today, reaching the lost, may mean that we have to lay down those preferences. That we are going to have to make some sacrifices. That we may have to be comfortable being a little uncomfortable to cross cultural lines. I think what Paul is telling us and teaching us here in the text is hard. It doesn't come naturally to us, but it is necessary. You see, as citizens in the kingdom, as disciples of Christ, we have the responsibility to make those sacrifices so the gospel can move forward. And those athletes there in Corinth, they competed, they disciplined their body for a wreath made of pine cones. Are you disciplining your body? Are you watching what you eat? Are you waking up early for a wreath made of pine cones? I'm not. I'm not stopping eating ice cream so I can have a wreath of pine cones. But they did. Because it was that valuable to them. And if an athlete in the ancient world, Paul says, is willing to make all those sacrifices for a temporary crown, a crown that to us today would be worthless, that we would perhaps buy at Hobby Lobby, shouldn't we be willing to sacrifice for an imperishable crown? And the answer Paul is wanting the Corinthians and us to draw is yes. That just as that athlete exercises self-control, just as he disciplines his body in everything, there is not a part of our life that the gospel does not touch. He wants us to understand that being a disciple takes discipline. That following Christ is more than a decision we make one time. He wants us to understand that following Christ is a determination to take up our cross, to deny ourselves, and follow Him every day. That there is no such thing as a couch potato Christian. And that's why the image of an athlete is so powerful. That running, winning, requires focus. It means saying no to some things and yes to others. See, when the rubber meets the road in our lives, we have to be willing to ask ourselves even today, are there things in my life that I need to say no to? They may not be bad things. They may not be sinful things. But they may be things in our life that are keeping us from running the race that God has set before us. And that means we need to ask some hard questions as we look at our hearts and look at our lives. When you ask questions like, is this going to help me reach the lost? Is this going to help me win the prize? And those kind of questions require discipline. Discipline to control our tongue, and before we speak, ask ourselves, is this really necessary to say right now? It means we have to discipline ourselves when we're on social media. And we may have the right to say something about politics. We may have the right to say something about some social issue. We may have the right to say it on any topic. But we need to pause and ask ourselves, does this help advance the gospel? You see, if we want to reach the lost, our focus needs to be the gospel. We need to keep the main thing the main thing. And the good news is that message has not changed. The message that Paul preached 2,000 years ago is the same message we preach today. That Jesus Christ died to save sinners, of whom I am foremost. Christ died to save. That's our message, that's our mission, that's our purpose. And we need to keep that first and foremost in our life. Maybe you're here and you haven't disciplined your body. You haven't disciplined your life. You've done some things, you said some things that have hindered the gospel, and you need to make it right. If we can help you with that, let us know. But maybe you're here and you've never become a follower of Christ. You've never said, I want to run that race. I want to follow Christ. We would love to help you with that. If we can help you with that, please let us know. While together we stand and sing.